In this video we're going to take a look at creating a high dynamic range image. All cameras, including those we pay quite a lot of money for, cannot capture the range of contrast that we can see with our own eyes. Now this gap between us and our technology is why we're often inspired to raise the camera to our eye, but maybe we're just a little disappointed when we first see the results as thumbnails on our computer, because there's a gap between what we saw and what we're able to capture. Creating a HDR image is a way we can better cope with the ratio of light to dark in our images. So instead of just taking one photo, high dynamic range uses 3 or more shots taken with different exposures, and then Adobe Camera Raw does a pretty good job of putting the images together. The idea is we use 3 or more images and we combine the dynamic range of all 3. Let's take a look at some of these images here. I'm going to highlight this one and we're going to look at the metadata. What I'd like to draw your attention to is this little item here, which is telling us that this particular image was shot with 3 stops more exposure than the camera wanted to give. The next one, if you look up at the top left, has 2 stops more exposure. This one has 1. This is the one where the camera felt the exposure was about right. Then moving past that to this one, we've got -1 exposure, -2 stops exposure, and -3 stops exposure. If we look at the image that was exposed to what the camera thought was correct, we can see we've lost detail in the skylights up there. We can take a quick look at that by opening this image up into Adobe Camera Raw. All I want to do here is to take the highlights down as far as they'll go and the exposure down, and you can see we don't have any detail in there. So the windows just turn into basically a grey blob. We've got the window panes, but we've got no scene from outside, which was blue sky and fluffy white clouds. Let me cancel this one and we'll take a quick look at one of the others. If I take you to this end of the scale and double click, we're going to find we've got quite a bit of detail in the windows at the top left. In fact, we can see it before we've even done any editing at all. So maybe a little exposure, a little clarity, maybe a little color, and suddenly we've got nice clouds outside the window. But of course the rest of the picture is pretty dire. So let's pick just 3 of those 7 images and make a HDR. It's a very quick process. So I've got a batch of 7 bracketed images here, but we don't really need 7. I think probably 3 is going to be more than enough, and I just showed you the 7 that I shot for interest. We certainly need to select the darkest image because I want the detail in the clouds. I think I'm holding the control key as I speak, I'm going to select the image that the camera felt was about right, and I'm going to choose one of the lighter ones too. I don't think I really need to go quite that light, but I don't think it matters much which one of these 2 I choose, so I'll choose this one. I'm going to hit the enter key and all 3 of those will be opened up into Adobe Camera Raw. Now once we have all 3 of those images opened up on the left hand side in the film strip, I'm going to use the Control A shortcut keys to select all 3 of those thumbnails. Over on the right hand side I am going to apply my lens corrections here to remove chromatic aberration and also enable profile corrections. But then I need to go back over to the film strip right at the top left of the film strip, top right of the film strip, and I need to select to merge to HDR. Now generally speaking this doesn't take too long, and then a new panel will appear on screen and we get 1 or 2 choices within this panel. The first choice I have, and it comes up ticked by default as you can see, is to align the images. Now I shot my images on a tripod, so I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, if unticking that box is going to help me in any way. It may speed up the process a little bit, but if I'd handheld the shots, then I certainly would need to align the images. And because my tripod was on a nice solid floor and I was using a cable release, I'm pretty confident that I don't need to worry about this. But if you see any ghosting when you stitch the images together, then of course you can always apply that and try again. We've got the opportunity to also apply an auto tone and color adjustments to our HDR. To be honest, there's no benefits one way or another. Because we're shooting RAW and it's going to create a HDR in RAW, well, we can always undo any changes that Photoshop makes, so we may as well leave that one ticked. And deghost. Just in case there's any movement in the picture, we can choose a higher level of deghost. We can turn it off, low, medium. Well, once again, I don't think there's much chance of that here, but it comes up by default, so I think I'll just leave it. So I'm going to click Merge and allow Adobe Camera Raw to give me the opportunity to save this. Now I'll save it exactly in the same folder as where the images come from, but you could place this elsewhere. You'll notice as well that it's going to save it as a digital negative, which retains the RAW status. And if you look over on the left hand side, you'll see Adobe Camera Raw creates the HDR, and we just need to wait a few seconds for the blue bar to creep to the right and the yellow triangle to disappear. I allowed the process to finish, but then I closed down to open up Adobe's Bridge. There's no real need for me to do that. I just wanted to bring you in here to show you that now we have over on the right here the HDR image. Now we could have renamed it completely, but as you can see, it's just picked up the name of one of those images and put -HDR. So now I've got this image, which is an amalgamation of this one, and this one, so it should have the dynamic range of all three. Now as we look at this, we can already see a little bit of detail in the skylights there, so things are looking good. Let's double click this, open it up into Camera Raw. Now we can see quite a few changes to the sliders. Remember when we went through the process, it gave us the opportunity to do some automatic settings, but nothing is cast in stone because as always we're working raw. Now looking at this image, I've got a bit of a lean on the doors here and a bit of a lean on the walls, and I'm just wondering if I could use my transform tools and straighten this up. But because I have got my subject filling the frame, it could give me a problem, but I'd like to give it a whirl. So I'm going to select my transform tools, go over to my guided option. I'm going to draw a line down there to tell Photoshop I want that part to be straight, and maybe down that pipe work there, and I'll say I want that straight too. Now you can see it's just about done it, but it's pushed the tail of the aircraft towards the left, so maybe I could use the sliders over on the right, maybe the offset X. I'm going to put my cursor in the box there so I can use my up arrow. I'll just press and hold, and you can see I can come in a little way before I start to get a little bit of a slither at the top there, but of course we could always put that right in Photoshop with content aware. So we've got a choice, but I think here for speed I'll just nudge it as far right as I possibly can, and I may even try to bring it down as well. So let me put my cursor in the offset Y and maybe hit the down arrow, and I'll come down as far as I dare. Now I need to nudge back up a little bit. So there is where I need to be for this image, and I think I'm reasonably happy with that. I'm going to pick up my crop, just click and drag, just to have a look at the rule of thirds. You can see we've got pretty good composition here, so I'm willing to live with what I have. I notice I've got a little bit up there, but a touch of one of the brushes would soon fix that. So I'll escape away from the crop because we don't need to make it. Lens corrections are already done, but the colour balance I think is a little too warm here, so I'm going to pick up my eyedropper tool. I'm going to click into the floor because I think the floor is going to be a pretty good natural grey, and I think that looks okay. So now I've just got to decide what I'd like to do. I'd like to put a little bit more clarity. I'll have a little bit more colour. Maybe I'll just bring the exposure up a tiny amount, not much on the plane, just a little bit in the center. But what I'd like to do is to put a graduated filter on the bottom, perhaps. Click and drag. You can see I'm using the aircraft as a guide there. All I've got over on the right hand side is exposure. That's all I really want. I just want to darken it down so we're pushed towards the main subject, and I could do the same from the top too, and that's done us a lot of good because as you can see there, it's brought those windows in just about right. Now the only other area which I think may need a little bit of darkening is the highlights on the floor. Maybe we can attempt them with the adjustment brush. Now you may notice that now we've moved through quite a number of videos, I'm moving along here a little bit quicker than normal. So I'm going to go up to my adjustment brush and I'm going to look over on the right hand side because I want to drop the highlights down. The exposure's already down, and I want to look down at the density and flow. I think I'll put my density around about, let's start around about 40 or 50, and the flow I'm going to keep it at 4 and see how we get on. And you can see as I brush over that area I can take that down. I'm working quick and dirty again. Remember, I say this quite a bit, but we would normally enlarge the image a little more just to take some of that away. Give a bit more of a shadow on the ground here and let it spread out towards us, and that's looking pretty good. A little bit of a light area around the back of the tail, so you know we could make use of what we've got on our brush. Still, it's a little bit on the fast side for me, so I'm going to drop it down even more, but you can get an idea of what I'm doing, just darkening down these edges a little bit to push the focus onto the image itself, the Spitfire. Now I could possibly do a little more to those highlights. Maybe if I select a new adjustment brush and I make the brush really big, just sweep along that area, but then along the top there and over on the right you can see I'm just holding things in nicely, doing a little bit of local work to suit my own personal tastes, but I think we've got a reasonably good image there. I'm going to hit the H key on the keyboard. That will take me away from the adjustment brush settings, and we can just look at the picture and sit back for a moment. I think there's one or two areas I'd like to do a bit of work on. I think I've got a little bit too much magenta in the picture, so I may try a little bit of manual movement here. I'm just going to drop that down a little bit. Maybe I'll try even dropping the temperature a little bit, and I think I like that a little bit better. I think there's one or two areas where I'd like to spend a little more time just burning in the background and the back of the tail, and I'd like to spend a little time on that, but you're fully aware of how we do that now with an adjustment brush. Now with a change to the image on screen, you may notice a couple of small changes I've made. I have made a small crop from the back and bottom of the image after all, but not very much. And I've just tweaked that magenta in the color sliders there just to move it a little bit more away from the magenta that I felt I could see in the aircraft. The one final thing is to pick up my radial filter. I'll double click onto the picture surface. In fact, I think, let me right click and clear that. What I might do here is bring it down and rotate it and maybe push it up to that sort of position. Then I'll touch the V key to hide the overlay, and we'll take a look at what we can do with that vignetting. I'm going to push my feather up quite a bit. You can see I want to make it quite dark around the edges because we are parked in the hangar, and I think I'm happy with that image, and I'd like to open it up into Photoshop. There's just one or two very small touches I would like to do to finish. As the image appears in Photoshop and we see the thumbnail in the layers window on the right, we can see that in fact this is a smart object, because when we turn on the smart objects they remain on until we turn them off. But what I want to do here, I want to do a little bit of spotting with some of the highlights. If I go over to the left hand side and select, for example, my spot healing brush, you'll notice I've got a no entry sign, because I cannot use this tool on the photograph while it's still a smart object. So I've got two choices though. I can right click just to the right of the thumbnail and rasterize this and take this back to a standard layer, which I think is going to be okay. But here's another little tip which is sometimes useful. What you can do is any of your spotting on a new layer. So if I go down the bottom of the layers here and I create a new blank layer above my smart object, now you'll notice I've got a brush. I have to make sure that I have this little box ticked which says sample all layers. But now we can start to do some work. So let's take a look at the woodwork on the right bottom. I'll use my control and the spacebar key to zoom in on that, because those little marks are drawing my attention. So using this brush, this is going to be a cinch. We just wipe over these and we can have these done in just a few seconds. Control 0 and we can take a look elsewhere. Now over on the right hand side there's a bit of light creeping under the door, I think, so once again I'll just make a small brush, and whatever it is, it's going to have to go because it's drawing my attention. And maybe there's one just up there, and then Control 0 again. It's sometimes useful, I think, to reduce the image to the size we normally going to view it, and then just address what attracts our attention. There's not very much left, but there's one or two, and I always say attention to detail is pretty important. We've got some little streaks in the doors on the top right. They could be dealt with in exactly the same way. And it's always quite interesting when you do any repairs on a new blank layer. If I turn the image off, you can see all sorts of little dots and squiggles over the image. Doesn't look very elegant when we view it like that, but it blends in perfectly when we see it with the image. But what we can also do is to turn it on and off. So if you look over at the doors, you can see all those little streaks and those highlights, and the same marks on that wooden trestle on the bottom right. You can see they're not significant, but they're one of those small steps we need to make. But once we're happy with that, of course we can go to the top right and we can flatten to finish the image. Now I don't think there's a great deal of purpose in comparing our finished image with what we started with, because we started with 3 different images which were selected from 7 in total. It's only been in the last couple of years that we've been able to make a HDR image within Adobe Camera Raw and retain the RAW status. So by putting those 3 images together, we can stretch the dynamic range of those 3 images into one. Yes, we still have to do our image editing, but with the original image that we would have shot had we just took one shot, we'd never been able to get the details through those roof lights at all. And the other thing I like about the HDR process through Camera Raw is that the image we get at the end of it is natural in color, and we can't tell it's a HDR image from 100 meters away, which used to be the case some time ago.